RNA which then can kind of make proteins that do something that perhaps make it a little easier for the RNA to just start replicating. The problem is the RNA itself isn't all that stable. So researchers who work with RNA basically has a shelf life of about 24 to 48 hours at a room temperature. So, RNA disintegrates pretty quickly, and so a mutation might have resulted in RNA simply just kind of copying itself and forming this more rigid structure that we refer to as DNA. And so the analogies I like to use between DNA, RNA, and protein is, first there was RNA, which we can think of as a recipe for cooking something. Now, a recipe is good, but you're not going to be able to eat the recipe, right? You are going to turn that recipe using ingredients from your environment into, whatever the like lo mein, whatever dish you are cooking. That dish you're cooking can be thought of as the protein. That's the thing that actually does something. It nourishes you, right? The recipe is just giving you the instructions for how to get there. And so the RNA is the recipe, whereas the item itself, that dinner, is the protein. And so where does DNA fit in? Well, a recipe is all good, but if you have something written just on a piece of paper or on a napkin, the recipes I have from my grandmother are all on sticky notes. Those don't last very long, right? Eventually it gets crumpled, the ink wears off, and the recipe is no longer saved. So the DNA instead is like the cookbook itself. It can hold lots of different recipes in it, and DNA holds thousands upon thousands of genetic information that gets turned into that RNA, those recipes, which themselves are what are directly converted into proteins. The recipes are what we use to make the dinners, right? So DNA is kind of like the cookbook. The recipes are the RNA, and the dinner is the protein in this case.
Professor, out of curiosity, what's the shelf life of DNA?
Much longer. So preserved in, the researchers are now, with advancements in DNA sequencing, we're getting now DNA out of fossilized animals. So if it's, especially like mammoths from the Ice Age, we have an almost fully annotated woolly mammoth genome now. We have the capability of creating a woolly mammoth because of that.
Is that a threonase?
What's that?
Primordial threonase? Oh.
Primordial threonase.
Yeah, isn't that like
One of the nucleotides, threonine.
I don't know who he's looking at, sorry.
No, I was looking at Lori, but. Yeah, well, that's why we're not making any woolly mammoths right now. But I mean, there have been other uses of DNA, and there is the question of what the effect of the reason we don't have woolly mammoths and other large mammals on this continent is because we killed them all, and our time on an evolutionary time scale, our time on this continent is relatively short. And so, we have impacted our environment more than anything else. And so there is that question of, well, if we bring the large mammals back, would it benefit the environment? But, we never actually, it would probably benefit the environment. But there's this disconnect because what's probably better for the environment is a lot fewer of us. So, there's a sort of, we've got stake in the game to not necessarily do that. But yeah, exactly. That documentary, Jurassic Park. Yeah, we learned from that. What we're going to kind of do is go through our own history as humans. So we'll try to cover a lot of ground. And these slides I've posted on Blackboard. Oh, why does it always do this? it sends the slideshow to a non-existent monitor, so I always have to change what monitor it's displaying at. And so just a kind of general sense of the timeline. I've mentioned this before. I don't, when it comes to the questions I ask y'all on exams and quizzes, there aren't that many specific numbers I throw out there. If there's a specific number, it's usually for a big event. So we saw that in the IRAP, right? 200,000 years ago, kind of the around the origin of Homo sapiens, our human species. Now, even if you don't know, you memorize humans with 200,000, usually the other choices I give you should be able to use logic to rule them out. So for example, I think the dinosaurs were one of the options. You should at least be familiar that those were several 100 million years ago, the dinosaurs. And then you may not know the number of when animals colonized land, but you can have dinosaurs without the colonization of land coming first. So you at least know it's before the dinosaurs. You can't have it the other way around unless it were all aquatic dinosaurs. So some of the more important numbers that you probably have seen before, but maybe it doesn't stick, are these numbers of 4.5 billion years ago when Earth formed. 3.5 billion years ago are the oldest fossil organisms of prokaryotes. So prokaryotes are essentially the first kind of living things to appear in the fossil record. I'm stressing this, in the fossil record, because we'll talk a little bit more about how the fossil record is really incomplete. Prokaryotes are these unicellular, single-celled, in other words, organisms. And a term that came up in the IRAT, they're in the domains bacteria and archaea. So bacteria are all the bacteria you're essentially familiar with. Archaea are kind of like more ancient bacteria. They used to be called archaebacteria, this domain.
Like archaic.
What's that?
Like archaic.
Yeah, archaic. Yeah, the term archaic comes from this. So, well, no, they come from the same word. But they used to be called archaebacteria and thought of as another type of bacteria, but they've since been kind of placed in their own domains. These are more ancient and exist in what are likely the original kind of life-promoting environments, things which are, ironically enough, the exact things that life probably stands the least chance of living in now. Really hot, really saline environments. So high salt, high temperature environments where really even if you go there now to these deep sea thermal vents and like the geysers of Yellowstone, you're likely only going to find archaea and maybe a couple other species of in the domain of bacteria itself. But they kind of started off there. They were likely among the first organisms, and they're still the only things that can kind of tolerate that. This is a side note, but likely the first prokaryotic cells likely lived in these dense mats, and that was because motility, as we'll see, kind of evolved later. So when you reproduce, your offspring is just kind of clumped right there next to you, and unless the current drags y'all away, y'all are just going to hang out right next to each other. Kind of like my daughter right now. Sticks to me. So there are a total of 3 domains in general. Another IRAC question, but again, those bacteria and the archaea. You'll see some of these terms. You don't need to be familiar with all of them, but just so you're kind of know what to associate some of them with. If it's bacteria, it's going to have some sort of bacteria ending to the name. The archaea are those halophiles, halo referring to kind of salty, and thermophiles, heat-loving, really bacteria, but their own domain now. And then the eukaryotes, some of these might not sound familiar, but others might. Plants, animals, fungi, protists, which we're seeing in 1102 now, and then some that maybe aren't as obvious to us, and we won't spend as much time on those, but they tend to all get clumped into protista. Protista, I mentioned in 1102, is kind of like the junk drawer of the eukaryotic life. Whatever can't be designated as a plant, an animal, or a fungus, we just call it a protist. It's the only non-monophyletic group. Well, if you don't know the term monophyly or monophyletic, we'll talk about that over the next 2 class periods.
Is that a single ancestor?
What's that?
Is that a single ancestor?
Yeah. So the description I give is, we can even just cover it now.
Sorry.
No. This is good. I like more, when a question naturally comes, then it makes sense to talk about it now, and instead of just going by the script or whatever. So there are these terms: monophyletic, polyphyletic, and paraphyletic. So if we think of this as a big old tree of life, and for now what I'll do is just kind of do this, and we'll just pretend this is all of eukarya. Not to be confused with Drewkarya, who's the host of The Price is Right. But eukarya would be a domain. It's a monophyletic group. The way I think of monophyly is if we imagine this all as one big tree. A monophyletic group is when you can kind of cut the tree at a point, and what you grab from that point you've cut, all that's included specifies what that clade is. So eukarya is a monophyletic group because at this point, which we can call the most common ancestor, we cut at this tree here, and everything that I'm holding, everything that stems from this point, falls under the eukaryotic group. This would be what we call monophyly. Polyphyletic groups would be where you kind of have to snip at some point. I'm trying to think of an example off the top of my head. But essentially one example would be the dinosaurs. So dinosaurs, now if we don't think of this as eukarya, but rather different dinosaurs tend to actually be a polyphyletic group because there is one group we don't classify as dinosaurs anymore, and those are the birds. The birds we now classify as their own group. They should fall under dinosaurs, but a lot of researchers don't consider them. And so, if you take this branch at one of the earliest dinosaurs, Dimetrodon, which I'll just use for an example, but it's technically just before a dinosaur. But think of that as the first dinosaur. Everything that descends from it would be a monophyletic group, but we cut the branch here to exclude the birds, and so everything else we're going to call a dinosaur, except for a certain group. Now, it could be one, it could be multiple branches we cut off, but the fact that we cut it off somewhere down the line describes this idea of polyphyletic groups.
And that's considered the outgroup? Is that what this would?
An outgroup is, we'll look at an outgroup in an activity later. It's a little different. It's more actually on the other side of this cut would be an outgroup. And then lastly is paraphyly. And this is really where the protists come in. Because within eukarya, we have animals, we have fungi, we have plants. In fact, might even look more like this. Plants here. And then we have a bunch of other stuff. We'll just call it A, B, C, D, and E. And so the way we classify protists is essentially we pick and choose whatever can't really fall in here, we end up calling that protista, the kingdom. So it shouldn't be a kingdom because in phylogenetics, every classification, family, phylum, order, kingdom, class, should be a monophyletic group. A clade should be, by definition, monophyletic. One of the only exceptions is protista. They're the junk drawer because anything that can't fall under these kind of just gets put into protista. And so this we say is paraphyletic because we're essentially just grabbing along a phylogeny whatever we want. And so protista would be called a paraphyletic group in this case. Yeah, where you can't just cut at one point and say this is my clade, this is my monophyletic group. Instead, and you're not cutting at 2 or more points. You're essentially just cutting all over the tree and then saying I got all these leaves. This is my protists. This is protista. So protista is kind of the one exception to the rule of the traditional classification scheme in phylogenetics and cladistics. So that's the difference essentially between, we'd call this paraphyly, some classification that were like this, that's polyphyly, and then the most complete as monophyly. Just to kind of make those look different, but maybe it doesn't. Monophyly, polyphyly, paraphyly. All right, cool. So we save time because now when we get to those slides, we can kind of skim through them. The point too is even though there might be some exceptions like protista, one of the reasons it's nice to refer to things in monophyly in terms of monophyletic groups or clades is because it really drives home this point that everything within a clade kind of descended from a common ancestor. And you can take that all the way back. Primates kind of all evolved from a common proto-primate ancestor. You take it back to animals all evolving from the animal ancestor. And take it all the way back to all of life eventually, and you get to this point of the tree. This idea that even bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota, the 3 domains, originated from that first living single-celled organism, from which everything else is derived. But the first to kind of be recorded on the fossil record were the prokaryotes. They're not only kind of the first organisms on Earth, but they're the most abundant. They can thrive in anything, too acidic, too salty, cold, hot, etc. They can colonize others. So there are more prokaryotic cells on humans than there are human cells. So we are more bacteria than human. And so, they've kind of, when you think of what the alpha kind of species is, it really just depends on your measurement, right? Prokaryotes can colonize almost anything, and no matter what the catastrophe is that hits Earth, prokaryotes will likely still be around.
Have you ever heard of gut microbiome controlling your decision making when it comes to what we eat?
Yeah, we'll focus on that in one class during Module 5 specifically. Yeah, we'll talk about gut microbiome affecting decisions as well as reproduction, immune system. I'm definitely into that because that's one thing I'm trying to study in my houseflies eventually, once I get funding for it, is to see how it affects their social decision making. So yeah. So, some terminology here. So the fossil record is really how we understand what life before us essentially looked like. It's by no means perfect, but it's really all we have, right? So many of the oldest fossils are what are referred to as stromatolites, just these layers of rocks that form what are called strata. That formed from the activities of kind of prokaryotes up to 3.5 billion years ago. So this 3.5 billion year mark is kind of interesting because this is really the point where Earth kind of developed an environment that allowed fossils to even be made. So there's this just missing history actually between Earth's first formation 4.5 billion years ago to 3.5 billion years ago. So, we can only go up to 3.5 billion years ago using the fossil record, but it's not to say that that is the start of everything. That's just the start of the book we're reading. If we read the fossil record like a book from beginning to end, it's like, starting at New Moon of the Twilight series and not having the first book, right? So that's one thing to keep in mind about fossil records is it kind of starts the story of life, 5 minutes into the movie. We're missing that first chunk. But like I said, it's the best thing we have, right? And so, see this point here, that drives it home. Possible earliest appearance in the fossil record. Just noting that this is really the first point that we could even find fossils. But there is potentially stuff before this. There are a lot of figures in your book, but like I said, a lot of these, we don't really need to, if you're good at memorizing numbers, then go for it. But I'm going to propose a different strategy, which will kind of drive home in the first activity that we'll do. But one of the reasons looking at fossil records can be particularly cool is because it tells us not only what organisms lived in a certain area or time period, but it tells us everything about that location during that time. By finding these organisms, you can get an understanding of what this once desert looked like. So just an example here, a desert in, I think, North Africa, where they found this fossilized whale, which told us that based on the strata that they found these whale bones in, this long ago, this area was likely an ocean, right? So by finding fossils, it tells you not just what organisms lived this long ago, but what did this spot even look like then? So, the history of looking at fossil records long predates evolution, the idea of that we associate with evolution by natural selection. We often think of evolution associating it with Darwin, but remember in Module 1, Darwin is not considered the father of evolution. He just came up with an idea for one way evolution can occur, natural selection. People have been running into fossils all the time, and the idea of the fossilized records of dinosaurs long predate Darwin, and so people had this understanding that organisms in the past looked very different. So even in ancient Greek times, there were philosophers like this guy Empedocles who spoke of the past looking like these very strange creatures. Like he kind of took it to another level about these three-headed beasts that eventually got whittled out, and what's left are people who descended from those three-headed beasts. But essentially what he's describing, even though it's a bit fantastical, is this idea of evolution, right? Things looking like something in the past and gradually changing over time.
What were these three-headed beasts?
What's that?
What were these three-headed beasts?
The three-headed beasts?
Yeah.
Oh, they were just probably some griffin to him. I don't know. I don't know what he called them, but he actually didn't put names to them. So he didn't think of it in terms of like Greek mythological creatures.
Oh, okay.
He thought of it kind of scientifically, and he would just kind of throw out things it's believed as just like analogies.
Oh,
So
wow.
he wouldn't find evidence for a three-headed beast, but he'd say you can imagine a creature looking very inefficient was his, because at the time the idea of multiple heads meant an individual who can't make decisions. So
okay.
a three-headed beast eventually got, formed, the individuals with one head. Now what the fossil record also shows us, and another important point about it, is that what the fossil record shows are not instances of microevolution. So we've seen this term of microevolution before. It's one of the ways we can measure directly evolution occurring in species like bacteria, where you see just small incremental changes in genetic sequences or small changes to a population over time. Macroevolution is really talking about the big steps. So things like the emergence of terrestrial vertebrates, what biodiversity looked like before and after a mass extinction. So the fossil record is good at finding these major events. So the asteroid that likely wiped out the dinosaurs. In the fossil record, you see dinosaurs everywhere until you don't. And you also see terrestrial animals until you start seeing other things, birds, the origin of flight in birds as well. So these larger steps, not just a difference in coloration of this one fish species. We're talking about big global changes are what the fossil record are best at showing. Now, why is that? It's because you need something big to happen for it to appear in the fossil record because of how incomplete that fossil record is. So the thing with the fossil record is you need just the right conditions to make a fossil. So first of all, you need whatever thing kills that individual, you need it to happen in just the right spot. If something dies out in the ocean and gets eaten before it falls onto the right type of substrate at the bottom of the ocean, it's never going to get fossilized. It'll get eaten or eroded before rocks can kind of slowly bury it over time. So you need specifically sedimentary rocks where they keep gradually getting deposited into these layers we refer to as strata. You also need the right timing, right? So an individual that essentially existed for a long time. Because you need just the right conditions, you need a lot of individuals dying in order to fossilize just a few of them. So the reason for this is because as the rocks are slowly covering the organism, other animals are coming by, picking apart whatever organisms they want, and maybe leaving behind 1%. Over time, more pick apart, and then there's 1% of that, 1% of that. And so whenever you find a fossil of, say, a dinosaur in the middle of nowhere, it's likely that there were thousands of dinosaurs that died in that one location. Now there are some kind of hotspots for fossils, and you do find something like a volcanic eruption just decimating a population, and something that is that catastrophic wipes out most life. So all the animals that died there aren't going to get picked apart by other living things because most of those have also died. And so in those rare instances, a lot of the wildlife, the flora and fauna, so the plants and animals, get preserved in those instances, but only in these rare major catastrophic events. So that's why when we think of the fossil record, we often think of things like dinosaur extinctions and these really big events that affected the whole world, essentially. The other thing is, even then, you're only going to preserve a certain select few species that all died from that catastrophic event, because you also need the right parts. When we find fossils, what do we associate that with of the animal? What part of the animal are we finding? Yeah, the skeleton, right? Just the hard parts. Really rarely, like an ice age fossilization, really not even fossilization, but rather, a freezing, we get some tissue out of it. But for the most part, fossilization refers to the bones essentially getting converted to rock, getting petrified. And so the organisms that don't have that aren't going to ever be preserved. So even when we see all these dinosaurs, we really don't have too great of an idea of what the soft tissued animals were at the time. So when we think of dinosaur life, you maybe think of massive insects and the dinosaurs themselves, but there could have been, you never think of all the worms that were in the soil. Any soft-bodied organism isn't ever going to be fossilized, so we don't know what that looked like. Everything was bigger back at that time, so even dragonflies were kind of the size of this table during the time of the dinosaurs. So you can imagine a worm actually looking like, if you've seen Dune, like a massive, man-eating worm. But we don't know because we just have no record of that whatsoever. So we can only go by what the fossil record preserves. But again, it's better than nothing. We at least know the big events that happened through this record. This part we can kind of skip for now. This is some memorization. But the important thing to note here is that according to the geological record, I'm not a geologist, but the main thing I take from this is you want to be aware of what eon we're currently in, and the difference between, you'll sometimes see the term eon versus era. So an era is within an eon. There are 4 main eons. We're currently in the Phanerozoic eon. But in terms of era, there are 3 eras within an eon. So just like there are multiple kingdoms within a domain, there are multiple eras within an eon. No, this is an iClicker question, so I won't say it. And what divides eras are specifically these major extinction events that we only know thanks to the fossil record. So the switch from, for example, the Paleozoic to Mesozoic era is characterized by the arrival of the dinosaurs. The Mesozoic to the Cenozoic is their extinction, that asteroid impact that kind of changed the whole world. I don't want to do that yet. What we will do now, I mentioned this point of not worrying too much about the numbers involved, associating an era with how many years ago it was, but rather using logic to help fill in spaces that you might not be as confident about. So there are some events that we can kind of place for sure in a timeline. If we are given a timeline that we have to fill out in chronological order, what I recommend is filling out the obvious parts first, and then using logic to say, for example, between the first protocell appearing on Earth and dinosaurs, if there's an option of animals colonizing land, it would be between those two, right? It wouldn't be after dinosaurs because dinosaurs were already on land. So you need something to colonize land before you can have dinosaurs. So let's go ahead and practice that by going to Blackboard and clicking that first activity, activity 1, where we essentially have to just complete that timeline. We'll just focus on that first page. Oh, and I have hard copy. Yeah, so just focus on this first page. The second one, I never, you can work on it if you want, but I'm never going to ask you a question about carbon dating. So that's really for a geology class to me, so don't worry about it. So just try, and for now, over the next 10 minutes or so, try and tackle just the front page of this activity.
Who wants this? Does anyone else want this?
Just a couple copies to save on paper, but